to the session of AZ305, Designing Infrastructural Solutions. So previously we have spoken about designing a governance solution where we spoke about management groups, root groups, resource groups, subscriptions, Azure policies, blueprints, and RBACs. In this particular session, we are going to talk about designing a compute solution. As we said, infrastructural solution could fall under any of the categories that could be compute, networking, storage, and DBs. Now, in which one part we are talking about is designing a compute solution. So in this particular topics, I mean, in this particular session, we would be talking about your virtual machines. We will talk about web app service. We will talk about Azure Container Instances. We will talk about Azure Kubernetes Services. We will talk about Azure Functions, right? And at last, we will also talk about Azure Logic Apps, right? Now, coming to the point where again we are taking an understanding, we have already gone through, let's say we might have already looked at the parameters of what a virtual machine is, how it is being launched and stuff. We are just trying to now understand it from a point perspective where we would implement the utilization of VMs, where in an organization as an infrastructural solution, I would bring in web app services, where I would bring in your ACI, where we would bring in your AKS, Azure functions, and so on. Right. So just for the discussion sake, when we talk about designing solutions around virtual machines for an organization, now we might be having a couple of questions or point of views, basically on the basis of which I would choose whether I would want to go with an offering of IaaS, PaaS or SaaS. Now SaaS would not fall here, but understanding the models that when I would want to have infrastructural service as an option opted from cloud environment, and when I would want to go with platform as services, right? Now, this is where we are discussing that virtual machine is something where at what times you would want to opt for such requirements, or when do you opt for infrastructure as a service in terms of compute, that is your virtual machines, which falls under infrastructure as a service, and PaaS services as we move further. So this is where see you can have a look that what could be the reasons to choose for your virtual machine instead of PaaS services. Now, if I talk about listing the requirements, one I could think of is basically I need control. I need control over the machine where I would want to work with or launch my workload with. Right. So I say major of the responsibilities, I would want to keep it at my end, and I would want to manage every aspect of that particular workload. I'm sorry. Now that is in terms of deciding on the operating system, maintaining the updates, patches, and everything. Right. I'm sorry. Yeah. Now along with that, I choose what I would want to bring in and deploy onto that particular virtual machine. And everything is me who would want to decide where I would just want the infrastructure to be provided, where my virtual machine would run is what we are looking at, right? Else, my another approach where I would want to choose virtual machine to be my solution is I have shorter workloads, testing environments where I would want to quickly launch something, do changes according to the requirement, test it and just discard it, right? Apart from that, if I would think I would need an infrastructure to extend my on-premises environment without acquiring the resources, without having an investment done on purchasing the resources for myself, I would hence go with just renting on a temporary basis, right? So that is where we are looking at, right? That is where I would choose virtual machines over the other following options, what we would have under compute. Now, when we choose VM to be our solution, we understand or try to take an understanding in terms of who will be responsible for managing the VM, where all I could go ahead and run those virtual machines, whether I could launch it only in a particular region or I have access to across all the regions, what would be the pricing and the stuffs what you will be going ahead and looking at. So that is where if I talk about where when to choose your virtual machines, as I discussed, if your requirement revolves around quick testing, troubleshooting different configurations, basically, as I said, you would want to test, have a small application developed, you wanted to test it, right? You want to go ahead and do those testings. So you would go take virtual machines, launch your workloads on that, and quickly test. Or if your workload requires a specific requirement, if it requires high performance compute, if it requires more memory capacity, whether it requires more storage capacity, right? So there are different offerings. If we look at VMs, we have VMs offered based on compute, based on memory, based on storage, right? Accelerated computing, high performance computing, dedicated GPU performance, accelerated computing is where the GPU falls in, right? So there are many aspects to it. You would go ahead and choose where which virtual machine you would want to. And as I mentioned, couple of more things. The same things are discussed here. That is, if you would want to extend your on-premises data center workloads without purchasing the required hardware. You just need to temporarily run the workloads. You don't want to have those infrastructural purchased for you on a permanent basis, right? You would want to run applications on cloud. Why you would want to do? You would want to move your workloads from your on-premises to cloud environment. So you would want to do the testing. So you would want to go ahead and do that. Right. So that is where quickly migrate your apps, fully control the computing environments. All this could be the parameters on the basis of which you would want to choose to go with your virtual machines, right? One aspect to it. So the first aspect, infrastructure as a service, organization would choose virtual machines to be their computing solutions under their infrastructure, right? So if I go ahead and see and talk about just planning the virtual machines, not only in terms of having the workload understanding, then you would go ahead and design your solution, right? Where under which network you would want to go ahead and launch that particular VM onto the cloud. What is the naming convention you would want to use? You would want to decide on the region. You would want to decide on the storage. You would decide on the operating system, right? Monitor your VMs. All these are the parameters where you would want to keep it under your control and you would want to do this. You would go with implementing VM to be your compute solution. And these are the aspects which you will regularly deal with. And this is where we talk when you want full control. And this is the control what we are talking about. Under which network you would want to run, right? Where in which particular region you would want to run. What are the storages which you would want to attach it to your compute solutions. So having all this in place is very much required. So if your organization is looking for infrastructure as a service, that is where we will deal with VMs, virtual machines, right? And when we say that moving a bit further now, your organization is somewhere into the place where they do not want to go with IaaS service. Instead, they want to opt for PaaS services, where they are saying major of the responsibilities, I would want to pass it on to your cloud environment, right? I do not want to hold it. Then I would go ahead and look for the services. Now, what are those services? Now, those services are one topic which we would be talking about is Azure App Service as a solution. Now, what is Azure App Service? Now, if I talk about with selecting a computing option, if I take a general example, if I take a scenario and I say an organization requires an application to be launched, or let's say there is an application which has to be up and running. Now, What are all the responsibilities which would fall under an architect when he wants to run an application? Let's say from scratch, if I see, first, I would have to decide on my computing solutions. I would have to decide what computing options I would want to have in place so that my app runs smoothly. Then I might have to decide on the operating system onto which I would want to deploy my application. Then I would have to decide on the runtime of my application, right? Then once this is in place, I would bring in my application, install it, basically deploy it and start running it. When it starts running, most probably there are two more responsibilities which would fall: scaling and high availability of your application. Now, when these are all the set of responsibilities, when it is an IaaS service, let's say this is something which you will have to take care of at every level. Anything going wrong, you will be the one who would be addressing those issues, right? Now, to overcome this, what we are slowly and gradually moving towards is to your PaaS services, where now you want to pass on the responsibilities, certain responsibilities to your cloud provider, that is to your Azure. Now, my set of responsibilities remains the same. It's just that it has been segregated now. Now, let's say you say that I do not want to take care. I don't want to have concerns in terms of deciding my infrastructure. I don't want to be dependent on this, or I might have no idea about it. I am an app developer. I don't deal with infrastructure. Then how do I go ahead and deploy my application if there is no infrastructure, right? I do not want to have burden of deciding on my OS, patching it, updating it, and everything. I do not have to take care of runtime also. I just need my application to run. That's my simple requirement. So is there any offering? So you say, go ahead, go towards your PaaS solution, where major of these requirements has now been taken care by Azure. You will just bring in your applications, deploy it on your web app service, and just utilize it. Now, this particular application could be your testing application, could be your development application, or it could be a fully functional production application. No matter where what your requirement is, now you can utilize your Azure app service for that particular requirement. So that is where we are just trying to understand that whenever you have got your web apps, right, mobile apps or any other applications where they have different programming languages used, there is a support for everything. So it is an HTTP based service that will let you build and host your apps, right? Choose the programming language what you want. You have automatic scaling and high availability, and also for your CI/CD integration, continuous integration and continuous deployment, you can go ahead and integrate it. App service enables automatic deployment from your repositories. It could be GitHub. You can utilize integrated with Azure Devops and other source controlling services. Now, there could be a private repository, public repository, anything. So basically, this can be a part of your CI/CD, your DevOps operation also, basically trying to automate the process of deploying your applications using your web app services. So this is what we are looking at, moving towards platform as a service and passing on the major of the responsibilities to the cloud provider itself. Right. So this is in terms of your Azure app services. Now we are very well aware that Azure app service basically works on Azure app service plans. So plan is what? The pricing tier, right? The pricing tier. So basically based on what is your requirement, what support you would want on the infrastructure should be shared, should be isolated, right? What is your requirement? That is completely dependent on what pricing tier or what plan you opt for. It is not only in terms of this, in terms of the total space, what you would be allocated, the number of applications, what you would run on Azure App Services. Do you have scaling options? Do you have deployment slots? And all is dependent on your Azure App Service plan. So based on your organizational requirement, you will choose what plan to go with. Accordingly, you will go ahead and utilize your Azure App Services. This is where determine the appropriate app service plan, which will determine the costing and scaling. Right? This app service, you have got deployment slots for having continuous deployments, right? That is integrated with Azure services, so you can utilize your AAD capacities, Azure Active Directory capacities for your authentication and authorizations, right? Now, this is what we are looking at when you are planning to utilize Azure Web App Service. You could think in all these parameter and implement a solution against compute. Now, as I discussed, the difference when to choose with VM, when to choose to go with app services is all dependent on the requirement of an organization at what times they would want to choose. Similarly, where this particular web app service is focused on deploying your applications, right? Web apps. Similarly, you have got PaaS services when your applications are containerized. Now, if my third requirement arises, if I have containerized environments, what do I utilize? Right. That is where we are discussing with your ACI and AKS. Now, what are these platforms helping us achieve? As I said, if you would want to have containerized environments where your applications are containerized and you want those containerized applications to run, the responsibility is that you bring in the environment on cloud where your containerized application could run. Now, I don't want to have that burden of me creating the environment, and you need to go with something which is managed service, and I don't should have a least responsibility on providing the platform. That is where you go with ACI, Azure Container Instance, and AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services, where if an organization is majorly dealing with containerized applications, the possibilities are high that the organization is already dealing with Kubernetes services. And when they would want to move towards cloud, they would be requiring a similar environment. And they say that we do not have to go ahead and recreate it from our side. So you need to have a platform available. So that is where Azure is offering that Kubernetes platform where you can run your Kubernetes workloads on cloud without having much changes done to your on-premises environment. You do not have to go with the burden of skilling your users again with the technology, as they are already aware with all the tools and APIs related to your Kubernetes services. You just use that platform on cloud and achieve containerized application deployment. As we go through, this is where we are saying when we have to design your container instances as solutions, you can either choose ACI, Azure Container Instances, or you could go with your Azure Kubernetes services. Now, based on what is your requirement, you go ahead and choose between the services. Now, just to come back and talk about certain limitations or differences between your containers and virtual machines, I could just generally describe that this is something, again, which enables the users to run their applications in the isolated environment where they have all their dependencies and environments available within the container itself. On a virtual machine, this could be something which you would have to provide it from external, and they could not run independently. Similarly, there are differences in terms of operating system, the deployment, the storage support, the fault tolerance, what you could come across. There are different things which you could involve and understand those over here. Okay, so that is in terms of your Azure container instances and Azure Kubernetes services. So this can also be a part. Along with that, now we are looking at serverless services. Now, what is a serverless service? Now, a general understanding what we take is that whenever we say a service is an serverless service, the simple definition what we could understand is the underlying infrastructure what would be required for that particular service to run will not be the job of or will have no relation between the user. The user will not be responsible for the underlying infrastructure of that service. You just utilize that particular service when needed and as needed. Now, in such situation comes a service called Azure Functions. Now, what are Azure Functions? Now, to understand what is Azure Functions, let's take a simple scenario and understand that I have a workload running, okay? Or let's say I have an application basically whose job is, let's say there is some storage service here where I've got, let's say, a video file. Okay. I'm just taking an example. This workload could be replicated or let's say associated to any of your existing on-premises environment and utilize this for such particular environment. Now, we are saying there could be a storage service what I am utilizing, and I'm saying my organization is dealing in an environment where there is a video file which is being generated by an XYZ entity. And when that is generated, and when it comes to this particular space, I have an application design whose job is to pick up this particular video, right? And convert this, let's say, have conversion in terms of it could be your video format itself getting converted or your viewing experience getting converted where the video is being resized to be watched either on a TV, on a mobile, on a website. Based on this, there is a resizing which is happening by this application, right? Simple shorts requirement or let's say simple requirement. But there is some complexity to this couple of challenges which I would face. Now, those challenges are that my organization, when it is dealing with such an environment, let's say I do not have any intelligence where this application, right, which is whose job is to pick up this video from here in the storage and convert it, has no idea about how frequently this particular videos are getting generated. When this application is not aware, then the challenge is that I have to keep this particular application up and running, right? Up and running to ensure that whenever there is a video coming in, this has to go ahead and pick that up and convert this particular thing. When I have to keep it up and running, the challenge is that possibility is that there could be a delay in generation of multiple videos. Now, when there is a gap, there is an idle time for this compute capacity where it would be up and running, right? Now, this idle time is what cost for me when I'm using it as a solution in compute that could be a VM, right? Now, I want to overcome these challenge and I want to bring in a mechanism where I say that my storage is still in place. My generation of video is still in place, but I do not want to keep this particular compute capacity up and running. This has to only come into picture when there is a video added to the storage, do the job, and then shut it down again. So that if there is any fluctuation, any delay in videos getting generated, I am nowhere running this compute capacity in an idle situation. So that is where we come up with Azure functions. Now to understand those Azure function, what we are saying, Azure function is a serverless application platform for compute on demand. Now what is this helping us achieve? If I take the same scenario, we are just bringing in a mechanism where my storage is when my user is generating a video, let's say as soon as the video comes in, I can build up a mechanism where this can trigger compute on demand. That is basically Azure function. Now, when it is triggering compute on demand or triggering your Azure function, there is an XYZ compute capacity which will be launched on demand. Once this is launched, what should happen? Your application should execute. Now, this application is referred as your code, which you will be defining in your Azure function. The job is whenever there are video coming in, trigger it, launch the compute capacity, execute the job with the help of your application, shut it down again. You are being charged only for the time where this application was up and running or the compute on demand was up and running and executing your requirement. Right? So that is where promote code reuse, scale easily, event driven. Basically, I don't have to come into situations where there is a compute capacity which could be idly running and that is incurring unnecessary cost in an organization. Right? So to overcome that, we have got Azure functions, which you can utilize. Right? This is, you can see avoid long running functions, know when to use durable functions, organize functions for performing and scaling, write defensive functions. So basically, we are just trying to understand what we have to consider at times when we are utilizing Azure functions. So in that, when I say avoid long running functions, we are saying this compute capacity is not meant for long running workloads. When there is a continuous workload which has to run, this is not for that. Where we are saying there has a limitation, there are small computational tasks which you have to perform, and after that, there is no requirement for your compute options to be there. At that point of time, you would bring in your serverless approach where compute on demand is given to you, right? It is not that you run your AD services on serverless approach. No, this is not something which you would utilize for. You're saying you have got a specific set of function after which there is no need of your compute capacity. As I said, previous example, a small application whose job is to only convert. Once the conversion is done, I don't have to wait for this compute capacity to be in place. It could be discarded. So any such kind of a workload is what you can choose where Azure functions can play a role. Right. Similarly, at last, we have got design for Azure Logic App Solution. Now, what is Logic App Solutions? Azure function is something which works on the basis of trigger we discussed, and it is on the basis of code what you give, right? Azure Logic Apps, on the other hand, defines the flow, workflow where you can automate actions after one another and define the logic behind that. If there is certain set of jobs to be performed, you go ahead and say execute job number one. If it is done, execute job two. If not done, what it has to do? It has to notify, it has to rerun what it has to do. If job 2 is done, execute job 3. If not, what has to be done? So similar workflow where you could integrate multiple services and define your workflow, right? You would go ahead and utilize Logic Apps, cloud-based platform for creating and running your workflows. Some of the use cases you can see: send email notification using Office 365 where a specific event happens, route and process customer order across on-premises systems and cloud services, move uploaded files from an FTP server to Azure storage, monitor tweets, analyze the sentiment, create alerts or tasks for item that you need to review. Basically, it could be utilized in any of the flow. The only thing is it basically works on logic. What flow you would want to utilize after a job is completed or not completed. You can see here. Yes, no, yes, no. What you want to do, what logic you want to define behind an operation. To do that, we go ahead and utilize Azure Logic Apps. Hope this gives you a clear understanding in terms of compute solutions to be designed. So keeping this in consideration, we will mark an end to this particular topic here and we'll see you in further modules. Thank you.